This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Hi, I'm Andrew from Parlogram, and on June the 15th, 1966, Capitol Records released Yesterday and Today, an album that would go on to become one of the most famous and controversial records in Beatles history. Yet 60 years later, it's not really remembered for its music, but for this. The so-called butcher cover has become one of the most recognisable, discussed and collected items in popular music, but the album itself has been largely forgotten. Growing up in Britain, Yesterday and Today wasn't part of my Beatles story. The songs on this album belonged somewhere else. As a result, I always thought of Yesterday and Today as just another one of Capitol's wacky American compilations. But the older I've become, the more I've understood why this album means so much to the people who grew up with it. Because behind the controversy of its original cover image is an extraordinary collection of songs. In fact, this album captures the Beatles at one of the most exciting moments in their career, just weeks before everything began to change. By the spring of 1966, Capitol found itself in an unusual position. For the previous 2 years, they'd successfully stretched the Beatles' catalogue by holding songs back and using them on future releases. But now they were starting to run out of material. At the end of May, the Beatles released paperback Writer Rain, but the problem for Capitol was that the new album, Revolver, wouldn't arrive until August. In Britain, fans simply had to wait, but as far as Capitol were concerned, waiting was not an option. By this point, American fans had become accustomed to having a new Beatles album in the shops every few months, and Capitol had little intention of leaving the summer of 1966 without one. Fortunately, they already had a number of tracks in reserve. The 4 songs omitted from the American version of Rubber Soul were still available, as were the recent hit singles Day Tripper, We Can Work It Out, and 2 tracks from side 2 of the UK Help album. But what they really needed was some new recordings. Capitol then did something they'd never done before. They requested 3 songs from an upcoming Beatles album, even before the album had even been released in Britain. EMI and George Martin agreed and sent over 3 songs destined for the UK edition of Revolver: I'm Only Sleeping, And Your Bird Can Sing, and Dr. Robert. Suddenly, Capitol had their album, and what emerged was a fascinating picture of the Beatles' past, present, and future.
I can't watch.
Me neither.
When I get my hands on those guys...
Uh-oh, now what? Cool, it's dark in here.
They must have forgot to pay their light bill.
Good old daylight.
We'll be safe now. Grizzly?
Any other words of wisdom?
No, but here's a few from our sponsor.
One of the things that fascinates me about music history is how much valuable information can easily disappear over time unless somebody takes the trouble to preserve it. Whether it's record collecting, music history, photography, writing, research, or anything you've spent years building up, having a place to organise and present that information properly is more important than ever. And that's where Squarespace comes in. Squarespace gives you everything you need to create a professional-looking website without having to worry about the technical side of things. You can create pages for articles, photographs, collections, videos, and research projects, while built-in blogging, newsletter, and member area tools make it easy to share your work with other people. It also includes analytics, so you can see how visitors are interacting with your content and what they're most interested in. So, whether you're creating a website for a business, a creative project, or simply a subject you're passionate about, Squarespace provides all the tools you need in one place. To find out more, go to squarespace.com for a 14-day free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/parlogram to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. My thanks to Squarespace for supporting the channel, and now back to Yesterday and Today.
1966.
Interestingly, Dave Dexter Jr., the Capitol executive most associated with the American Beatles albums, was no longer overseeing the group's catalogue by this point. Following complaints from Brian Epstein about Capitol's handling of Rubber Soul, responsibility for the Beatles had instead passed to Capitol's national sales manager, Bill Miller. Then there was another twist. The versions Capitol received weren't identical to the ones British fans would hear a few weeks later on Revolver. Because the album was assembled before the mixing had been finalised, some of the songs appeared in slightly different mixes from those later heard in Britain, giving American listeners a few Beatles recordings that were unique to Yesterday and Today. The differences are mostly minor, with the alternative backwards guitar passages on I'm Only Sleeping being the most noticeable. Of course, in 1966, nobody knew that. Most American fans had never heard the British versions and had nothing to compare them with. But for a brief moment in the summer of 1966, they were listening to Beatles recordings that nobody in Britain could buy. There was a downside, however. The inclusion of 3 Revolver tracks helped make Yesterday and Today a stronger album, but it came at the expense of what followed. When Revolver finally appeared in America 2 months later, it had effectively been stripped of half of John Lennon's contribution. While Yesterday and Today benefited enormously, Revolver paid the price. From today's perspective, especially from a UK point of view, Yesterday and Today's track listing looks like a low-value collection of random leftovers. You've got 2 tracks from side 2 of the Parlophone Help album, both sides of a 6-month-old single, and 3 from the forthcoming Revolver. Yet the more time I've spent with Yesterday and Today, the less random it starts to feel. On one hand, you have songs like Drive My Car, Nowhere Man and If I Needed Someone, recording the Beatles had originally intended for Rubber Soul. Then there's the Day Tripper We Can Work It Out single, containing 2 of the strongest songs they released during that period. And joining them are 3 tracks from the forthcoming Revolver, offering American listeners an early glimpse of where the Beatles were heading next. The album also brings together Act Naturally and What Goes On, the only time 2 Ringo lead vocals would appear together on a Beatles album. Yet if Yesterday and Today was simply a hastily assembled Capitol cash grab, why are so many American fans so attached to it 60 years later? Well, part of the answer lies in the music itself. Whatever you think of Capitol's approach, there's remarkably little filler here. 5 of the album's 11 tracks would later find their way onto 1962 to 1966. Add those 3 great Revolver songs, and you can begin to understand why so many American fans have such affection for Yesterday and Today. It may not have been an album the Beatles intended to make, but it's a remarkably strong record. But I think there's something else going on here as well. For many American listeners, these songs weren't borrowed from Rubber Soul or taken from Revolver. This was simply where they lived, and for many fans, where they still live today. Drive My Car wasn't a Rubber Soul song, it was a Yesterday and Today song. The same was true of Nowhere Man, Day Tripper, and We Can Work It Out. Growing up in Britain, I associate those songs with different albums and different releases. But for millions of American fans, Yesterday and Today wasn't some odd Capitol compilation, it was simply where those songs belonged. To understand why Yesterday and Today remains so beloved, you also have to remember how people consumed music in 1966. Today, we can compare British and American track listings with a few clicks, or build our own playlists in seconds. In 1966, most fans had no idea what was happening on the other side of the Atlantic. They simply bought the records available in their country and enjoyed them for what they were. They were simply listening to the latest Beatles record. And yet for all the great music on this album, that's rarely what people remember it for. Instead, 60 years later, it remains best known for something else entirely: the cover. Or more specifically, the cover that most people never actually owned. Today, the Butcher cover has become the ultimate Beatles collectible, and one of the most famous and valuable record sleeves in popular music history. There are books about it, websites devoted to it, and collectors willing to spend extraordinary sums of money to acquire one. The Butcher image itself originated during a March 1966 photo session with photographer Robert Whittaker. By this point, the Beatles were beginning to tire of their clean-cut image, and Whittaker was exploring more surreal and provocative ideas. What nobody expected was that Capitol would actually approve of one of those photographs for the cover of their next Beatles album. By the time objections began arriving from distributors, retailers and radio stations, it was already too late. Around 750,000 sleeves had been printed and distributed across North America. In its recall notice, dated June the 14th, just one day before the album's official release, Capitol insisted the photograph had been intended as satire and blamed the controversy on public misinterpretation. Either way, the result was the same. The cover was withdrawn and a replacement sleeve was rushed into production. Capitol suddenly found itself facing one of the most expensive mistakes in its history. Rather than destroy the records themselves, the company recalled the sleeves. The cost of replacing them has been estimated at around $250,000, a substantial sum in 1966. The replacement photograph showed the Beatles gathered round a steamer trunk in Brian Epstein's office, and while considerably less controversial, it was also considerably less memorable. Some sleeves were destroyed in landfill, but many were returned and had the new cover pasted over the butcher cover. For most people who bought this album, it looked like this. Even if, by sheer luck, a butcher cover was hiding underneath, many never knew it. To them, Yesterday and Today wasn't a collector's item or a future investment. It was simply the latest Beatles album. It may not have been an album the Beatles intended to make. It may not be part of the official catalogue, and it will probably always live in the shadow of its infamous cover. But 60 years after its release, Yesterday and Today remains a fascinating snapshot of the Beatles at a unique moment in their career. A moment where Rubber Soul was still fresh, Revolver was just around the corner, and the stage gave way to the studio. And perhaps that's why for so many people, these songs still belong here. If you're interested in exploring some of the regional differences in how Beatlemania was experienced across North America, one book I'd recommend is Piers Hemingson's The Beatles in Canada. It's an extraordinary piece of research and contains countless stories that simply don't appear in most Beatles histories. I'll be looking further into this book over the next few months, but if you're interested in finding out more about this amazing book, I'll put a link in the description. As someone who began my Beatles journey in Britain, Yesterday and Today was never part of my Beatles story. So if you grew up with this album, I'd love to hear your memories of it. I'll be back next weekend with something completely different. But that's all for this one, so I'll say bye for now, and thanks for watching.
What do you know? First prize.
I knew that trophy would go to his head. Tune in next week for some more gripping adventures.